Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and we're so glad to have you here with this study on Genesis chapter 1. We're in day 5, and day 1, God created the heavens and the earth and a great abundance of water. Day 2, and light, and day 2, he put an air pocket in there and separated the waters from the waters. And day 3, he made the waters collect into pockets and land to appear. Um, and then day 4, he created the sun and the moon. And now he has all of the nurseries available for the animals. The plants are on the earth. And so now we come to day 5. Now, it's really a complicated process. If you've ever tried to have an aquarium, and so you get this glass container, you have to make sure it's plugged so that the water doesn't leak, and you have to have it aerated, and you have to have gravel and stones in the bottom, and you have to have seaweed in there. Then you get algae in there, so you got snails that climb up and down the glass. You got bottom feeders that kind of get the waste products and they eat that. And then you have the swimmers and you have the little ones that like to be in among the seaweed, and you have the bigger ones that need lots of area to swim. Um, just all these things, you got to get the right pH and the right temperature and the right food for the various fish. And it's really quite a complex. And if you don't get everything right, fish die right and left. And if you go to salt water, that's even more complicated. And but to have this so that it's properly aerated, people have ponds and they aerate them, so again, twice the amount of fish in there. There's air that's mixed in. You don't have these strata of dead water where fish can't live, and all these things that go on that make it possible for you to have life. And so God has created this giant aquarium called the rivers and seas. And it said in verse 20, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. And God created great sea monsters, every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Well, that's enough. We're going to kind of unpack this now. And so God made this giant, aerated sea and rivers. And of course, it's a giant aquarium, if you will. And the moon was one of the things that needed to be in place so that sea would rock and the waves would help with aeration and smash on the seashore, and then it would mix with the air and bring back that oxygenated water back into the sea for the animals to be able to breathe in the sea. Of course, there were some animals he created that didn't breathe from the water. They had to come up and get a breath of air, and these were mammals that lived inside of the sea. But a giant aquarium, if you will, and the moon and everything was in there, that great aerator, so that all of this was ready. And God had a great aviary too, a cage, if you will, for the birds. You say, well, they don't see the cage, they don't feel the bars, it's unlimited. Well, it is limited to a certain extent, but birds can fly as high and as far as they wanted. And so, they had this great area that they could expand into. It had extra barometric pressure because you had the waters above the earth and as well as below the earth, and it kind of acted like a lid and created a barometric pressure that was greater than we have today all over the entire Earth, a greenhouse effect too. And so these animals could fly in that extra heavier air pressured medium. Uh, try and help you understand this. When I try to float in a pool or in a pond, my legs just sink. They go down like a rock, and I just barely can float. I have to keep moving a little bit, can't stay afloat because of the heaviness of certain parts of my body just pull me down. But when I went to the sea with its extra weight in the water, I floated just fine. And so it bore me up. Now my wife doesn't have any problem with lakes or seas, but me, I'm a heavier person, and I needed that extra weight in the water to bear me up. Well, when you have extra weight in the air, greater pressure, it can bear up greater flying creatures. And so, back at the time of creation, the barometric pressure enabled bigger birds or bigger flying creatures so that they could fly, greater flyers. And they also had trees, and birds like to nest in trees and roost in trees. Not all of them did. Some of them nested on the ground, but nevertheless, there were trees, and there was food in the trees for them. And one of the things that I learned was that birds, a lot of times, will eat plants. You know, they eat grains, but they'll also eat plants. And so this was available for them. So there was fruit trees and nesting areas and green grass and edible vegetation. So this great aviary was set up with extra air pressure to support larger flying creatures as well. So now we're going to look at the specifics that were stated here. And you may think there's not very many specifics, but there is more than a lot of times meets the eye. And it literally, the Hebrew, which is translated in the New American Standard, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. NIV has let the water, singular, teem with living creatures. And the King James Version, let the waters, plural, bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life. The literal Hebrew, if I translate it word for word, is this: let the waters swarm with swarmers. The word swarm is the verb, and swarmers is a noun. They're the same word basically, but has a little bit different ending. And so it says swarm with swarmers having a living soul. Okay, so the King James, the New American Standard, the NIV all kind of struggle with how to bring out what they think the original language meant. And so this is something that I looked at, and swarm with swarmers as a very inexact term. What are swarmers? What it talks about life that's all varied. It doesn't specify whether it's snails or whether it's worms or whether it's fish or whether it's whatever. It's just swarms of swarmers, lots of them in mass all over the sea and the rivers, in the water. And it could be fish, it could be snails, gastropods, bivalves, all kinds of things. So literally swarm with swarmers having a living soul. And the word soul, nephesh, is the word that just means living thing. But this is the first time it's used. It's not used of plants. Now, I'm not saying that plants aren't living, but they're living and they have composed makeup that's different than the living things that are being introduced now. And so there's kind of a quantum step up, and these things reproduce in a certain way, um, and they team and swarm and move, where plants are stationary, except of course if they're algae and they're riding on the waves and they're not so much stationary. But these swarmers, these things that can move, these are not plants. These are, uh, creatures. And so I don't want you to misperceive when it says here, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. I don't want you to get the idea that this was kind of a spontaneous generation, that the waters just gave forth this. You need to back up just a little bit and look at the first three words of verse 20. It says, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living. That doesn't eliminate that God did a creative act. Now, he may have used the existing molecules and elements, just like on day 6 when he created man from the dust of the ground, but he created man. And here he created the creatures from perhaps the elements that were already in the water. We didn't have to, could have. He could have done it another way, but nevertheless, these creatures that are in the water were created, and God said, "Let them." So He's the one that did the creating. This having life a quantum leap up from plants. That doesn't mean that there aren't plants that move, like Venus flytrap that shut by a trigger mechanism onto insects and digest them. Trees sway. There might be movement as a tree migrates and sends roots down and then grows another plant 10 feet away and stuff, but that's not the same thing as these things that are creatures that can move. And so these tremendous things that were created, these have things of the sea include a great variety of life. My wife and I enjoy going to the sea, and we look at the various seashells. And if you were able to go and look at the bottom of the ocean, you'd see it just swarming with uh, gastropods, which are single-shelled creatures. Most of us call them snails, but they have all these shells that then they get uh, destroyed by the wave action, or they just die, or they get eaten, and their shells wash up on the shore. And we look for those shells and we pick them up. Oh, here's a pretty one. Oh, look at how this is curled so much, or look at the color on it. And there's so much variety. Or you have the bivalves, and the bivalves are basically something that has two shells. It goes like this. And there's so much variety in that. And the reason why I'm telling you these things is not to give you some type of biology lesson, but to kind of help you understand that God created these things and He has such variety. And there's little shells and there are huge shells and there's different colored shells and there's shells that have different ribbings and just magnificent. And I find these extremely interesting, and I buy books on it to study these shells that we are picking up and looking at. And it's just amazing how many different types of shells there are. And these are all crawling on the bottom of the ocean, just teeming with life. And the stuff that we see on the seashore, those aren't live, those are dead cases of these animals. But it just kind of gives you an idea of just the variety of swarms and moving creatures that are on the bottom of the ocean. Snails, mollusks, corals, sponges, one-celled organisms, starfish, sand dollars, on and on it goes. It's just amazing, all these creatures. And that's just those little things. Then you got hordes of fish. I mean, some of these are single swimmers that swim all by themselves, but a lot of times you have hordes of fish. They swim in schools, and there's tremendous quantities of these fish. Um, Men can go out now and put out nets and bring in uh, hundreds of tons of fish that they've caught in the ocean. And there's a tremendous amounts of fish. When I go fishing, I catch one at a time. But I consider that fun, and I do that from time to time. But these hordes of fish, all different sizes, delightful sizes and colors and adaptations. I'll never forget my daughter was telling me about the flashlight fish, and she told me that it made its own light, and so this was very interesting. There are strange creatures also, like the squid or the octopus, 8 legs, jellyfish, sea cucumbers, crustaceans, includes the lobster and the shrimp and crabs, all these things crawling around and doing their business. So they've got crabs, they've got lobsters, and they've got shrimp crawling around on the ground, and there's jellyfish and octopus and all kinds of things around, and there's fish swimming, and there's coral reefs, all kinds of life in this thing. Just delightful. And then there's really big things, and they are mentioned separately, like down here where it says God created the great sea monsters, the Tananim, if you will. That's the Hebrew word. And every living creature that moves. Now, the Tananim, that's an interesting word. It's translated dragon 8 times, sea monster, um, and then it translates it as whales and various other things. But the root meaning of Tananim is something frighteningly large. Now, the largest creature that we know about is still alive. You know, we hear about these dinosaurs that they find, and that they were mammoth and walking upon the earth. But the largest creature that has ever existed still exists, and that is the great blue whale. And the great blue whale can grow up to 110 feet long. Now, you won't find them that big right now, but if they are left to grow the 80, 90 years that they can live, they'll get up to 110 feet. And not only will they get up to 110 feet, but they'll weigh 300,000 pounds. That's 150 tons. Tremendous, tremendous creatures. And these creatures were so great that they could live through the Great Flood. They could live through tsunamis. They could live through practically anything. They just can sense trouble is coming, and they can swim away from it. They can communicate with each other, being 300 miles away, and it goes through the seas like that, and they can locate each other. Tremendous creatures, and they are a testament. People go out and they whale watch, just like people go to see the greatest trees that are on the earth, the sequoias. people go out in the ocean and they try to see these great fish. It's just a marvel. People watch animals all over the world, all different types of animals. We have a zoo not far from this building, Boulder Ridge Wild Animal Park, and people come from all over to see the animals just being displayed, a variety of them. And it all bespeaks to the greatness of God and how He has so much abundance and detail and architectural and engineering of these creatures so that they can live the way they live. God is great. And it says, fill the waters of the sea after their kind. Now, evidently, there were sections of the sea that could be expanded into, and they eventually did all that. But fill the waters of the sea, be fruitful, and multiply. So marvelous, marvelous. The sea was teeming with all this. And even after the great flood, even after the fall of mankind, even after we've lost a number of creatures in the sea that we know we used to have, but we can't find them now because their skeletons are buried in the mud and we find them. Still, we have such tremendous variety, speaking of the greatness of God. Well, that brings us to the skies now. And it says here that God created the great, everything that moves in the water, and every winged bird after its kind. And it said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Now, that word bird, it's the Hebrew word oph, and it doesn't necessarily mean bird only, but anything that flies. And the Hebrew word for flying thing, which is oof, so you have oph and oof, just a change of a vowel. So this oof is translated flew, flies, fly, flying, sweep down, and it can be used of anything that flies. So birds probably would be better if it was translated, and God created the flying things. Could include bats. It could include any number of things that fly. Pterodactyls that probably needed more pressure so that they could still fly. And once again, God's variety and depth of birds. My wife and I, we watch birds and we direct them to our feeders, and we, have lists of birds that we have seen. And I mean, we're just amateurs. We love to do this, but there's people that set out every year to see if they can spot 900 different types of birds. I mean, these people are really into it. They'll travel all over the world to see birds. But there are so many different birds, and their adaptations are marvelous, different colors, different sizes. And once again, just as God made all these creatures with their great varieties, God also can make all these creatures with their great varieties in the area of flying things. So just because it says birds here in the King James or in the American Standard doesn't mean that it means only birds, and it means flying things. And so God created all the flying things. I mean, you can go to rookeries. Rookeries are nursery places where lots of birds of the same type will congregate, and they'll make little birds, and they have thousands upon thousands of these in these rookeries. And so there's tremendous birds everywhere. You can go to the shores today and you can see seagulls flying around. You see great masses of migrating starlings, and you can see the geese flying in their V's. It's just amazing. The sandpipers, as they fly with their long necks around here, pong, pong. And of course, the seashore, and you have the little sandpipers that run up and down on the seashore, uh, going in to get something uncovered by the oceans, then running back again. And you have the pelicans with their great big jaws, and how they scoop up fish and various such things like that. Amazing. So, birds, man would look at birds and they'd say, I wish I could fly like that bird. That would be amazing. If I could find out how that bird could fly, we could mimic that in some way and we could get ourselves up there. Well, it wasn't until Orville and Wilbur Wright that we figured out how to get that lift so it could support the weight of a human and move them along. And we began to study birds and how they fly and how they turn and uh, the different ways in which they do things. And we learned how to fly from birds. We also learned how to stay warm. I mean, the ptarmigans, there are a game bird, so to speak. You can eat them. Um, they live in the Arctic, and in the summer they have a brown plumage, and in the winter they turn white. They grow feathers on their legs and on their feet. Um, they even have feathers that grow around their nostrils and on their eyelids so that they can stay warm. They plow into the snow and they use the snow and their feathers as insulation, and they can survive these 40 below zero temperatures and then the mighty wind chill blasts that take it down to 100 below, and they can live in the Arctic. They don't migrate away, and then not only do they do that, but the feathers on their feet act like little snowshoes that give them more um, flatness across the snow so they don't sink in. And these are amazing birds, and so we've learned about insulation from birds and how they can keep themselves warm and these adaptations. Um, there's the hummingbird. Its heart beats at 300 times a minute. They have their metabolism is so great that they have to be sugar junkies and get nectar from flowers and get the sugar. At nighttime, they have to hibernate or they can't live through the night. They're so tiny. When they gather stuff for the nest, they gather spider webs and they make their nests out of spider webs. Incredibly flyers that can elevate like a helicopter and go up and down. We learned certain things from them about flying. And then you have the ostrich, a huge ostrich. They're not a flying bird, but there were even bigger birds than that are not available today now. But big birds, big eggs, tremendous. You have geese that can fly up over Mount Everest. When they told this man in 1950 he was on top of Mount Everest and he saw the barred geese fly up over Mount Everest, almost over 29,000 feet in the air. It wasn't considered possible for a creature to fly up that high, and yet this barred goose could do this. And since that time, it's been seen over and over again. And so we learned from the goose what we needed to do so that we could fly up so high, our men and our people, and the pressures and things that had to be done. But it says that God blessed them. God blessed them. And it was the first time that that was used. And in the blessing, he said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so they were incredibly able to reproduce after their kind. I mean, you didn't have some ostrich look at a hummingbird and say, "Oh, let's make let's get together and make ourselves other little ostrich hummingbirds." There weren't such thing. That hummingbird said, "You're not my kind. I'm going to be a hummingbird." The ostrich said, "I need to find another ostrich." They reproduced after their kind. The same with fish, and they reproduced and filled the area. And there is so much that we can learn as we look at God's great and mighty creation. And I'd like to finish with this one passage of Scripture found in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31. Spiritual lesson that we can learn. Says here, "Yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength." Well, that's something. You just wait. "They will mount up with wings like eagles." That doesn't mean that we'll sprout wings, but there'll be some type of ability for us to soar up over those things that hold us down. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. And there is a spiritual strength that we can gain from waiting on the Lord. So here's this eagle, a majestic and great bird, and it's sitting maybe on a tree limb, and it isn't moving, it isn't flying. But then when it puts out its wings, there is a force that can lift it that's greater than gravity, and it can soar. And my friends, when we wait upon the Lord and we decide to exercise our spiritual wings and we trust in Him, there is a lifting of our spirit and our personage, not in a physical lifting in height, but a lifting in spirit. And we're able to do more, we're able to go forth, we're able to endure more because we have the help of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a spiritual element, my friends, that we can learn and get from the Lord.